All right, so in the last video, we talked about control variables, right? And how we can include these control variables to deal with some concerns about selection bias, so long as we're willing to assume the treatment is as good as randomly assigned, conditional on those control variables, right? So as long as we're looking sort of at a narrow enough subsample of the population, then it's as if we've got a coin flip for who's treated and who's not treated. Okay, so the key piece of that, though, is that we're observing these variables that once we condition on them, we've got random assignment or something that looks like random assignment. It's often going to be the case that we observe some things in our data, but there's going to be other variables that we don't observe that we might worry are going to be related to who's treated and who's not treated in a way that matters for the outcome. So in other words, we might worry about this thing called omitted variable bias, right? By which I mean, if we're looking at a regression like this, omitted variable bias is when there's something in this residual term, there's something that's related to y that is also correlated with DI, and it's something that we're not explicitly controlling for. It's something that we don't observe necessarily in our data set. So that becomes a problem. It's called omitted variable bias. It's sort of that's like a type of selection bias that we would have in our of what we've been calling selection bias that we have in our estimate of the causal effect. So let's do an example of that where maybe there's some additional variable that we're not seeing in this data that we looked at before. Some variable like, can I play with this? Some variable like anti-Americanness. Anti-Americanness, yeah. And let's call that ZI, right? So we've got some cities that are more, that I'm just going to use an indicator variable here, but you could do sort of the same idea with the continuous variable. But let's say Tikrit is anti-American and Kirkuk is anti-American, by which I mean just like there's some popular opposition to the American occupation in the city. Okay, so it might be the case that people's opinions about the American occupation are related to both the violence in the city, which is our outcome, and whether or not that city gets treated with this infrastructure program. Now, important to remember as we talk about omitted variables that you don't get too carried away with it, right? It only matters that we're not observing this variable, anti-Americanness. It only matters if that variable is related to both the outcome and whether or not a city gets the treatment, right? If you're talking about like the number of green-eyed people in the city, right, that's probably not related to violence, even if it is related to treatment status for some reason. We picked it based on the number of green-eyed people, right? That's not gonna bias our estimates unless it's related to both of these things, right? So just because we don't observe everything in the universe doesn't mean our estimates are necessarily biased unless the thing that we don't observe is related to treatment and our outcome. Okay, so let's think about what this would mean for our previous estimates, our previous estimate of the average causal effect if we were leaving out this variable that actually did matter for who's getting treated and who's not getting treated, right? So the way we can think about this is to do a long regression, sort of the same regression that we were doing before, but now we're going to include this ZI, like imagining that this ZI was observed, right? We're saying that this here is, this stuff is not actually observed, but we're going to pretend we do observe it and see what happens. So So if we were to run that regression, just like before, right, where we conditioned on xi, right, and did the same thing that we did the average observed difference, but conditioned on this variable, we're going to do the same thing, but for xi and zi, right? So now we're looking for that difference between the high poverty cities that are also anti-American, right? We're looking at treatment versus control for them, and we're going to do the same thing for xi equals 0 and zi equals 0, right? I think those are the only ones where we actually have a treatment and control group within that slice of the population here. So let's look at this one first, right? So we're comparing high poverty cities that are also anti-American. So we've got Tikrit and we got Kirkuk. Okay, Tikrit is treated, Kirkuk is not treated. So we've got 300 minus 325. So we got a minus 25. Now, let's look at the low poverty cities where they're not anti-American. So that's Karbala and Mosul, right? Karbala's treated, Mosul's not treated. So looking at that comparison within that sample, we've got 125 minus 150 equals minus 25. Now, as I mentioned, there's two other combinations here. So we could look at high poverty, not anti-American, but that's only Ramadi, right? So this is another important thing to think about. We're only getting our estimate of the causal effect here off of the subsample of our data set where we actually see some variation, right? We're conditioning on these variables, but once we condition on these variables, there's no variation within high poverty, not anti-American, right? So it's not going to, we don't have a comparison there that's going to contribute to our causal effect here. Okay. So same idea as before. We're going to take our weighted average of these two estimates, right, which is a simple thing to do in this case, and we get this minus 25. So before we were getting this minus 40, and now we're getting this minus 25, right? So the emitted variable bias, the bias in our original estimate from not including this very important variable, the bias in our estimate is minus 15. So we were sort of overestimating the crime reduction from this program because we were including a city in our comparison. So we were sort of comparing Kirkuk, right, this high poverty anti-American city. We were comparing it with Tikrit, but also with Ramadi, which was not anti-American, right? So we were sort of so we weren't getting an apples to apples comparison because we weren't comparing this high poverty city that didn't get the treatment with high poverty city that did get the treatment and had the same level of anti-Americanness.